60 years ago, an amateur archaeologist found what he believed were the remains of the very first Roman road in London. Was he right? And can we find it again and rewrite the history books about the birth of our capital city? From the southeast, straight into the heart of London. And below us is the route that the Romans would have taken when they first invaded Britain. You can still see the line of the straight Roman road below us. But something very weird happens to that road. A few hundred yards before it reaches the River Thames, it suddenly veers off to the right. It turns and follows the meander around to the north and crosses the Thames here, at London Bridge. Now that little dogleg can't be original, can it? The Romans would have carried straight onto the banks of the river. So what we're going to try and do is to find the original last few hundred yards of the Roman road. And when we've done that, we'll know exactly where the town of London first began. If we ignore that dogleg in the road and fly in a straight line until we hit the Thames, we find ourselves much further upriver from the city, and right over the top of the grounds of Lambeth Palace, the London home of the Archbishops of Canterbury since the 13th century. So we begin our investigation on Lambeth Pier, right in the middle of the Thames.
Here they are! Oh, so glad you were able to come.
It's a brilliant view, isn't it?
It's wonderful.
You get a move on, Tony.
Yeah, sorry. I never realised that Lambeth Palace and the Houses of Parliament were so close. And that's MI5, isn't it? That's a cosy little triangle. Nice to know we're all so well looked after.
Yeah, we made it there.
So is this where we reckon they'd have crossed?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is fairly convincing. We've seen it from the air and it looks really good from there. But if you look on the map, we've got this road map here. I think it's fairly clear the alignment of the Roman road from Canterbury. If you project it from the Old Kent Road, it's heading straight for Lambeth.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of the river, the Watling Street, the A5, which is the Roman road up to the Midlands, also heads for Lambeth.
But the crucial thing also, Mick, is that the road was known as Watling Street here and Watling Street there, implying originally one road straight the way through.
The implication here is that there was some sort of ford or bridge or something like that.
So we're going to be able to do something in the gardens of Lambeth Palace?
Well, I reckon that's the place we should start looking.
Well,
because,
I
that's
think
the nearest piece of open ground around here, isn't it?
And everybody's quite happy for us to go and dig up the Archbishop's garden, are
I
they?
think the Archbishop's quite happy, which is important.
And more importantly, he's away for the weekend.
I've come across this paper by a chap called Bernard Davis in 1935, and he put in some trenches in the garden over there, he reckons he found a road going through this point.
It would be nice if we could find those trenches again, actually, wouldn't it? It's very lucky to hit the road just putting them in at random like that. So.
Come on,
let's just start.
First thing is that 2,000 years ago, the Thames looked very different. The Lambeth bank was a maze of marshy bogs, which as a North Londoner confirms all my prejudices. The Romans, having marched through all this, made their crossing at a point somewhere along the bank on the right. If we can locate the first road, the crossing point, and the settlement connected with it, we might be able to say where London began. Was it down at the city or up at Lambeth? There are some good reasons for exploring the palace gardens first. This land has been owned by the Archbishop of Canterbury since 1170. So it's been largely undisturbed for 900 years. In the last few years, Roman pottery has been found in the grounds, and coupled with the Davises' trenches, there's enough evidence to suggest the road could have gone through here. Also, the palace grounds once stood hard up against the river, so perhaps the actual crossing point might be somewhere beneath this vast lawn. Anyway, here's where we start, by doing a geophysical survey. But we're also going to try something completely different. For the Romans to have put a road through marshes, they'd have needed high, dry land to build on. We're going to try and find that ancient dry land. In the incident room, Carenza meets Jane Siddell, a Museum of London archaeologist who's got lots of data on the ancient geology from boreholes that have been sunk in this area.
These are the spots which have been generally done by engineering companies, clustered mainly here near the station and then further to the bottom end of the park at these locations marked on the map.
But there's still quite a gap in the middle of
yes.
the palace. And so if we could get some useful calls out of that, that would tell us whether this area is higher or lower than the surrounding area, whether it actually would have been suitable for putting a road on.
Yes, that's right.
So we'll sink our own boreholes in the neighbouring park and gardens, combine that with their data, and in the computer produce a 3D picture of what Lambeth would have looked like to the Romans. If there's any obvious high land, that's where they'd have built the road. We start in the public park next door. How we detect this high land is by extracting core samples of the soil underfoot. We're looking for layers of natural gravel which would have been dry land 2,000 years ago. But all morning we turn up good old London clay. The gravel must be further down.
Nick, I think we might have found that first trench.
Oh, right, what Davis's trench?
Yeah, it looks quite promising actually.
Davis dug 2 trenches here 60 years ago. In the second, he claimed he'd found the Roman road, but in the first trench here, he found gravel layers, the ancient dry land, and some ditches.
We've laid the tape along it. It's 100 foot long.
That's much longer than I thought.
It's 8 foot deep.
8 foot?
8 foot deep.
How wide?
It doesn't actually tell us how wide it is, but it's probably about 1 metre in width. And there's a depression. Can you see this? This depression, the tape's lying along the edge of it. Mick's just on one side of it there. There's a depression going across, and there's a change in the grass texture at that end as well. So, within a band somewhere of this width, following the line of the tape.
That's much longer than I expected. That's a big old, What about his other trench? Have you fixed that as well?
We haven't actually located it yet. We'll do that next. But it's somewhere under those bushes, I suspect, at the moment.
Well, I had no idea that he'd such a big hole.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Geophys team are hurrying to complete their survey. Although we can only work in the park and gardens, there are over 10 acres of them, so they'll have their work cut out. Robin and Victor are exploring Roman techniques for surveying a route through virgin countryside.
Well, they had their own team of surveyors known as agrimensores, using the Roman equivalent of the modern theodolite, which was called the groma. And it was a vertical staff on a little stand, on the top of which would be 2 cross pieces, and from these would hang plumb bobs. And he would line these plumb bobs up with the chaps and the distance.
Once the route was surveyed, the builders would move in. When working in marshy terrain, first they'd put down a foundation of logs and build on top of that. We're going to make our own cross-section of a Roman road. That way, we'll know what to look for in our excavations. Harvey Sheldon, authority on Roman London, is here to supervise.
This is the sort of thing that would have basically we're looking for.
There's from the roads in Southwark, running up to the Thames, where you're going across marshy terrain, you've got layers of timbers like this, mainly alder, mainly young alder. Probably what you get built above that will be a clay and gravel base upon which you'd put the metal surfacing, the gravel surfacing of the road.
So in a day or two, we'll end up with a sort of layer cake of different materials stacked on top of the logs. None of the time team seem particularly impressed by the size of this garden, but they're all from the countryside, so they're used to big gardens. But to me, as a Londoner, it's amazing. I mean, this whole thing is a private garden, and it's a few hundred yards down from the South Bank. Make a great NCP car park, wouldn't it? Got the Geophys yet?
Yeah, well, we are.
Yes.
And?
There you are.
Well.
And what's the bit that you think might be the Roman road?
Well, it's just possible that we've got something coming at a slight angle here. But the trouble is, this is only looking half a metre into the
We're
ground.
far too shallow. And
whereas the road is too...
Well, what comes out of the
shallow.
excavation that Davis did, it's about 6 feet deep. This dug is 6 feet under.
So this is probably much later?
Oh, yes, it is, yeah.
The Geophys team will bring in new equipment to take a deeper reading, and if that's promising, then Mick's talking about putting in a trench near where Davis found his road.
We do this long trench, what, 20 metres long, something like that?
20 metres?
Through here, yeah.
That's a big trench, isn't it?
It is a long trench, and also judging by Davis's work and other work, we're probably going to have to go down about 8 feet. So really, I think we ought to get on with it.
But before we dig that massive trench, we'd better check that Davis's observations were correct. So we'll sink a test pit today on top of his first trench. As the test pit got started, some of the locals were keen to watch what was going on in the gardens.
I think we're a safe distance as well.
Around this area used to be a marsh.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, if you go down very deep, it's going to fill up.
Well, one of the arguments about where the Roman road goes through here is it actually uses the islands between the marshes.
Yeah.
In the meantime, Robin went to the palace library to get in amongst their archives. He's looking through Roman accounts of their invasion for any clues as to where along the river they may have crossed.
Oh, wow.
It's magic, isn't it? This was once the medieval Great Hall of the Archbishops of Canterbury.
It's like Gormenghast up there. What have you found?
Well, I've managed to locate apparently the only contemporary account we've got for the Roman invasion of 43 AD from a Greek chap called Dio Cassius. And he tells us the Britons retired to the River Thames at a point near where it empties into the ocean and at flood tide forms a lake. And apparently the Britons managed to get over the River Thames. They knew all the secret ways, but the Romans had trouble. And eventually, in pursuing the remainder incautiously, they got into swamps, from which it was difficult to make their way out, and so lost a number of men. And Claudius makes his way from the Mediterranean and joins the legions that were waiting for him near the Thames. Taking over the command of these, he crossed the stream and engaging the barbarians who had gathered at his approach, he defeated them in battle and captured Camulodunum.
So there's no clue here about where exactly they managed to get across.
Yes.
Another local resident, the Bishop of Lambeth, dropped in to watch us digging.
It's like sort of radar almost, that's probably a good way to describe it.
Right.
And when you've seen them taking the signals, that all gets built up into a plan of what there is underneath.
Right.
But this particular thing here is trying to get the depth. Here we know that there's 4 or 5 feet of soil. In fact, you've just seen it in that trench. It's gone down 4 or 5 feet. So we need to get underneath that to see what the archaeology is below that.
What we can presumably be fairly clear about, there's nothing under here other than garden. Is that right? Because we know it's been the Garden of Lambeth since 1200. Well, I mean, Roman.
Yeah, that's right. I think we can in later times, say in the Middle Ages onwards, we're probably. There's a lot of documentary material and so on, isn't there, for a place like this?
That's
right. But once you get into that Saxon, Roman.
Oh yes, well, who knows?
And indeed prehistoric, you see. I mean, there's gravel under here, so there could easily be prehistoric structures as well.
That's very interesting. Well, I do wish you well.
Jolly good.
At the test pit, Phil's looking for a gravel layer and some ditches that Davis saw here 60 years ago.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it?
Suddenly, something else turns up.
Just dropped out.
Oi!
Mortaria.
Yeah.
The Romans have been.
Isn't it convenient of them? They always leave big bits of pot around.
Just when you're there, Phil, with your spade.
We'll do a reconstruction of
that. The Romans.
Well done. Can I have a look? I'd like to do a reconstruction of that. What shape would that be?
It's what we call a mortaria, which is a
flat.
No, it's a rim dish, and it has these heavy grains on the inside, and it's used for pounding up foods.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Like a pestle.
So the Romans are definitely in Lambeth. But has this piece of mortaria come from a settlement related to that first road?
Can you see?
It's a bit like a big slice through the ground with all sorts of things going on.
There you go.
Towards the end of the day, the Geophys team's deep survey turns up something curious about 6 feet under the ground.
And this is this funny shaped thing, we don't really know what it is, so we want to go and have a look at that, another look.
So what do you think that thing is that over on the left-hand side there?
Well, it's difficult to say. With the black and white screen, it's the contours and colours aren't very good for us to sort of say just now.
Yeah.
But
you can't twist your arm and say, is it likely to be a road?
No, you can't twist my arm.
I can't twist your arm or it's not likely to be a road.
We're not saying just now.
Yeah.
We're not saying just now.
But it might be something archaeological.
Could be.
Yeah.
Right, end of day one. Where have we got to, Phil?
Well, I reckon we're looking pretty good actually, because I mean, for not very much effort, we've been able to sink our test pit in, and I think the most important thing is that we've confirmed Davis's section.
At the moment, we've got some peculiar things which we don't fully understand. It might just be the road. Claire and Claire are just doing a bit more processing. But until they've completed that, we can't be certain.
So 60 years ago, this old guy, Bernard Davis, was digging in this garden, and we're the first people to dig here since. But where we've dug is where he didn't find the Roman road, right? But tomorrow we're going to go back to close to where he reckoned he did find one, and armed with our geophysics, hopefully we'll find more of the extent of it and find out whether he was right or not. And maybe
It's going to be a heavy day tomorrow.
To Bernard Davis.
Yeah.
Bernard Davis.
Great.
See you after the break. Beginning of day two, and we take to the river with Gus Milne, who knows all about the river levels around the city during Roman times. While Carenza's looking for ancient dry land around Lambeth, what about the river itself?
We have to know about the river and what height the river was to know whether the land we discovered was going to be covered at high tide, at low tide, or not at all. So we've got to find out what the river level was in the Roman period to know what the land was like.
You've done a lot of excavations along here, haven't you, on Roman side, Saxon and medieval, which you must have gained a lot of information
That's right.
from.
We now know that what we see here, this river, is nothing like the Roman river. It's dirtier, it's much deeper, it's narrower, and it has a much greater tidal range than in the Roman period. Underneath
London Bridge now, isn't it?
We're coming up to London Bridge, and we're now in the Pool of London, and all these buildings here are seated on top of and in front of the ancient Roman port, which lurks underneath that lot.
So that's way back under those office blocks then?
You're absolutely right. It's much further back, 150 metres to the north of the present river. We've got the natural riverbank with the first quays in front of it. You'll see a cutback with a church of St Magnus the Martyr on it. That's on the head of the medieval bridge. And to the north of that, on the other side of the street, we found the remains of the Roman bridge. Between the church and the monument, that's where the Roman riverbank was, with a Roman quay and the old Roman bridge. We've worked out how wide the river was by finding the riverbank, and we've found how high it was by finding the top of the Roman quay.
And presumably the river was just as wide on the south bank too.
Oh, even wider, even wider. Can you see Guy's Hospital, the building right back over there?
With all the little satellite
That's
dishes
right.
on it. Yeah.
In the grounds of that hospital in 1958, they found the remains of a Roman boat in a creek. So the water was right back there. So just this side of present-day London Bridge, the river is almost a kilometre wide.
But all Gus's work has been done down here at the city. We're hoping we can apply his methods up at Lambeth. Why did they move the crossing point from up by Lambeth to down here?
That's something we're going to have to establish when we find out the nature of the crossing place at Westminster. I think we can get the answer to that when we see exactly what that crossing was like.
Back at the site, the Geophys team now seem uncertain about whether they have any clear evidence of a road. Only by excavating will we know for certain. Phil's got the digger started on the big trench, near where Davis claimed he saw the road. I had a lovely time on the boat and all that, but I still don't really have a very clear picture of what the Roman shoreline would have looked like.
OK, well, perhaps a plan would help.
Yeah.
This is a map of the River Thames present day. Look how narrow that is. That's our dear friend London Bridge.
Right.
And you can compare that with the 1st century map here, the river at low tide, and here the river at high tide.
This is Southwark here, is it?
That's Southwark, that's right, Southwark Cathedral there. This river at high tide is 1 kilometre wide.
But have we got similar sorts of evidence for around Lambeth and Westminster?
Well, we haven't yet, but I think we have ways of sorting that out. Provided we've got that 3D digital map, that's going to be a good guide, because what we can do is we can pump in this tidal information, high tide at plus 1.25, low tide at Ordnance Date, and we can pump that in. That'll give us some idea, but we don't, of course, know whether it was tidal or not. So what you've got to do is to find out, is the river tidal at Westminster? And one way of doing that is to dig a little trench to see if there's any diatoms in it.
What are they?
Now, diatoms are these wonderful little microorganisms which have particular preferences for salt water or fresh water or brackish water. If you find some of those, they'll tell you how tidal the river actually was.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
they're clever little creatures, if you can find them.
So, I mean, what we're going to...
Phil's got the job of finding those little diatoms.
We need a bit of urgency then, by the sound of it.
We need to get a wiggle on.
Where's our digger driver?
He's digging a third trench over by the river wall. Or that is, he would if it wasn't for urban bureaucracy. Because this hole's close to the street, we're going to need a permit. We have to check under the ground for electricity cables, water mains, sewer pipes, the Jubilee line, and anything else.
So we find something.
But it'd be nice to have a digger. Right then, what's your diagnosis? Nothing there?
Nothing there, you're all right to dig.
We can get on with it then.
Yes, please.
Right, let's have the digger in then.
By now, the team's scattered far and wide. Robin's taken up residence in the palace archives, still looking for early references to the first crossing point. Mick, Carenza and I take to the air to see if the layout of the roads helps us understand the overall picture.
We're over Lambeth Palace now, look, Carenza. You can see the big tower and the hall. And then somewhere down there would have been our crossing point.
So the Romans would have built the road towards somewhere they could get across.
Yeah.
But where would they have crossed to? Is there somewhere obvious on the Westminster bank they'd have aimed for?
We know that Westminster down there was on an island originally, this thorny island, presumably Thorn Island, with water around it. So they would have probably used that as a hard standing as well.
So from Thorny Island, they'd have moved through what are now St James's Park and Green Park.
And then, of course, eventually they struck off both westwards and northwestwards with roads, but particularly northwestwards. We can see the alignment of that with the Edgware Road today.
The Edgware Road's part of the Roman road?
That was the one that was heading northwest along the A5 right up into Shropshire with one of the legions going off in that direction. And it still begs all sorts of questions about, in a way, why London didn't grow up at Lambeth and Westminster. You know, there was this original road crossing there. There must have been some really good reason that it didn't suit them to develop it.
Same question I asked Gus. Why did London grow up here and not at Lambeth? We've got to try and answer that before the weekend's over. At the third trench, we're looking for silt, the ancient riverbank that would have had all those little diatoms in.
What you do, we can't reach the right depth, we take some of that out, so it goes drops down inside and goes deeper.
Right, oh I see, right.
That's brickhead, isn't it?
Though we go down some 15 feet, all we get is good potting soil.
I don't think it's going to work, Phil.
Hang on a minute. Can you cut the motor? What'd you say?
I don't think it's going to work.
No?
No. There's such a depth of made ground. I think perhaps there may have been some digging down.
Right. I mean, is there nothing we can do with it?
There's nothing we can do with this material, no. We just haven't got the right stuff.
Just sort of record it, locate it.
Record the depth, locate it, and put it on
and
the
then
map.
fill it in again.
Then we'll have to fill it in again.
Meanwhile, Carenza checks in at the big trench.
Yeah, sure.
How's it going? Can you get me
Well,
up to date?
it's going. It's nothing too exciting so far. So what we're now doing is coming the full length to try and pick up the so-called road at this end. But I mean,
Have you found anything
Yeah.
that you think Davis might have thought was the road?
not that he might have thought was the road, but I mean Barney is picking up some small cut features which have got Roman material in them. So I mean the Romans are here, but it's at the moment it's very much background.
But at the moment, the feature that Davis thought was the road is still eluding us.
So it seems to be.
At our Roman road, work continues on the next layer. Though there's no sign of the road in the trench yet, Robin's found something he thinks might be important from the earliest records of London.
This is the earliest detailed map of London that we've got of 1562. And this shows two sets of stairs near Lambeth Palace here. One where the horse ferry left from, but here Stangate stairs crossing directly to Westminster. Stangate is a very old name.
When you say very old, it's Saxon?
Well, yes. I mean, it almost certainly means stone gate, although the significance of the gate is a bit difficult to determine now. But if we go into the 13th century Archaeepiscopal, lovely word, the Archbishop's Register, the Archaeepiscopal Register, we know that there was an ancient way to this particular crossing point.
That's interesting.
So, a Saxon name for a set of steps down to the river, and an ancient road that led up to it. Is this our crossing point? And if so, where is it now? At our Roman road, they're putting down the final surface, the metalling.
Phil!
Back at the trench,
Come and look at
Stuart
this.
has a revelation.
Think you'll like this?
What you got there then?
Well, I think you're digging garden features. That
Yeah?
these gravel terraces that you've got down here are actually formal garden terraces.
What's the age of this?
This is 1746, this map, showing all the gardens around the palace. This stream's coming in from outside the palace gardens, coming in through here, and it's been canalised into a formal water channel. I think when Davis was digging here, what he was doing was digging these garden terraces and this water channel. It's not, I don't think it's a Roman road, I think the layout's too good.
And that probably is.
So what was it Davis saw in his trench? Was it a layer of natural gravel? Or could it have been an 18th century garden path? I'm really frustrated, Mick. It's the middle of day 2, and quite honestly, we haven't found sight or sound of this Roman road yet. Have we been wasting our time?
Well, I don't think we've been wasting our time. We were going for a fairly small slot in the garden to pick it up. And it may be that it's actually outside the area we've been looking at.
Outside the palace gardens, but where? Harvey has a theory.
I think it is outside the garden, and I would think it's much nearer to Westminster Bridge.
So more that way than
Yes,
than
more
this way, in
slightly
fact.
to the north of the garden.
Yeah.
And I would think it crosses. I mean, there is an ancient road called the Stone Street.
The work that I've been doing in the Palace Library speaks of the ancient King's Highway in 1553 heading straight for Stangate. We've got references to the Bishop of Rochester maintaining a crossing point there, and an ancient way leading from Stangate to Carlisle House, which is the successor of the ancient manor house of the Bishops of Rochester before Lambeth Palace was created.
Yes.
Well, can we dig up there?
It's entirely covered in development. Do you want to go and knock at St Thomas's Hospital
I
door?
think this is the problem, that we saw this very clearly, that this is the only open space for a long way around here. It's the only place we could get any geophysics in this side of the river. It's the only place we could put a trench in.
Which is why Davis dug there, of course.
Well,
as
that's right. I mean, if it's going to be north, as you're suggesting, then, you know, we're into sort of develop there.
So a big change in thinking. Robin and Harvey think the road and crossing point are north of the palace gardens, somewhere in the grounds of St Thomas's Hospital. Robin's archives suggest Stangate was somewhere close to where Westminster Bridge is today. And directly opposite is the Palace of Westminster, built on top of Thorney Island. That's what they would have headed for, the first bit of dry land on the other bank. On the basis of all this, Mick sent the Geophys team over to Green Park to see if they could pick up the line of the road as it headed northwest, away from the river.
This is the lines the Roman road might have followed north of the river. We're in Green Park here. Buckingham Palace just there.
So the problem we've got is time, so what we're going to have to do is a series of transects at right angles to the projected line of the road.
So you're going to come across from Constitution Hill, sort of across Green Park?
Yes, and hopefully we'll get high resistance peaks and matching in a line, if that's going to be the line of the road.
Like the Geophys team in Green Park, I wondered how Davis could have got things so wrong. I could see this layer of gravel at the bottom of the trench, but whether it was natural or the remains of a garden path or a Roman road, I couldn't tell. So what would a Roman road have looked like? But this is really tasty, isn't it?
Well, the work that's been done here gives a very good idea of the agger, the raised mound on which a Roman road would sit, particularly for drainage purposes, so that it would stand sort of proud of the ground levels.
So when Davis was digging in his ditch and he saw a gravel line like this, which was actually natural gravel, it was that he mistook for a Roman road?
Yes, I think that's what happened, and that's a very, very common failing, or a common habit, I should say. It happens today that people, when looking for Roman roads, they see layers of natural sand and natural gravel, and when they get the gravel, they think that they've actually found the line of the Roman road itself.
Why would the Romans have bothered to build something as big as this?
Well, actually, the Roman roads are in fact rather bigger than what you can see now. I mean, evidence for a number of the roads, like Watling Street further to the northwest, and the main road between London and Colchester, suggests that they may be something like 60 to 66 foot wide. This is only 18 foot wide, so you're talking about a huge highway with a raised centre. That's right, carry on.
To here somewhere.
Yeah, more or less to there. Sloping tracks, and then side tracks coming out on either way. So
side tracks, like a hard shoulder.
That's right. Yes. So you would have the raised centre for the fast traffic probably, and the lower tracks for the slower traffic.
But why?
Well, they would need a very good system of communications in order to be able to control the province, to move their men around, to move communications around at speed. I mean, Roman roads were obviously a tremendous innovation to Britain, and of course, when they fell into disrepair and disuse, although a lot of the lines survived, people were never really capable of building anything similar until the early 19th century.
At the big trench, there's definitely no sign of Davis's road. But there's plenty of pottery that needs recording, and which may point to a settlement in the area. And we're just about finished taking core samples, which means we now have new data that's going to change the picture of the Lambeth Bank.
Oh,
Right,
that's
so-
very much like gravel, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So how does this compare then with the other one you did?
This one's actually much higher. It's what?
1.2.
Sorry?
1.2 metres.
From the surface?
Yeah.
What was the other one?
It was
2.5.
Yeah?
It was much, much deeper in the park.
All these measurements go into the computer, and sometime on day 3, we'll have our 3D picture. End of day 2, we've got the biggest trench since the Battle of the Somme, but quite honestly, I have no idea what we're really doing. Carenza, how far have you got?
We're still working on this topographical map to find out whether there was an island around here that a road might have run on. And we've sort of broadened out the geophysics as well. We've been into the Green Park near Buckingham Palace to see if there's a continuing line of a Roman road going through that. So we're trying to spread our options, I think, at the moment, but we're waiting for the results from all of that, which should be through tomorrow.
So basically you don't know either?
No.
Phil?
Well, I have had something to do with this trench. I must confess there's very little in it.
So basically all we've got is a big zero?
No, that's not the case at all. No, tomorrow we need to do right by the archaeology in the trench and record what we have got. And there are plenty of things to record here. We are getting finds. We've got some nice pieces of Roman quernstone here made out of lava, imported from Germany, and we've got quite a lot of pottery. We're getting Roman pottery like this colour-coded ware. This might be similar to what Davies was calling Samian ware in his notes.
The evidence doesn't suggest that there's a road in here, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a road in the vicinity. It's likely to be quite close to the settlement where there are features like wells and ditches, and I would suspect that we would still find it, or at least that it is still there somewhere about 150 metres to the north of this site.
Whenever anybody looks at this part of London in future, they're going to have to take into account the trenches dug by Time Team here that show that the road doesn't appear to come in this direction. It must be in some other place.
And the Geophys boys are still looking for it.
Yeah.
So maybe by this time tomorrow they'll have found it. Let's keep our fingers crossed. It's the beginning of day 3, and it looks like we've busted Davis's theory wide open. For 60 years, archaeologists have thought that the Roman road went right through the Archbishop's back garden. Now it looks like they were wrong. But we've still got this second theory, the one that Robin and Harvey Shelton were arguing, which is that the road hit the river about 200 yards down that way. Remember, at the beginning of day 1, we said we'd do 3 things. We'd geophys, we'd dig a trench, and we'd also make a 3D map to see what the land actually looked like round here in Roman times. We still haven't had the results of that map, and it's only when we do that we'll know what the shape of the land was as it came down into the water, and consequently where the best crossing point would have been for the Roman army. But this map's using data from 3 different sources: the British Geological Survey, the Museum of London, and our own measurements. So it's taking the computer time to absorb it all.
Morning there, Squire. Nice morning for it.
Phil's getting back into the trench to clean up any remaining features, including a post hole that looks pre-Roman.
It looks as if what we've got in here are the remains of some of the formal gardens that were around in the early part of the 18th century. What we've been doing is mapping out.
Patrice Springett, the Archbishop's social secretary, is shown our survey of the garden and where the 18th century formal paths would have been.
What would be nice from the management of it for the future is if we can establish these features are still here, you could actually replant the gardens in a period style if necessary.
Meanwhile, a local resident brings us a little late morning snack.
Phil, Tony. Hello, how's it going?
Oh, not too bad.
As you're in Lambeth, our local delicacy.
Jellied eels!
Please, yeah.
Wow.
Okay, lads?
No, it's not okay.
Oh, fantastic.
So
Come on, Phil, you've got to. They're wonderful.
Are they?
Yeah. Oh, they are fabulous. Oh, let's
I knew you'd enjoy these.
Scrape the jelly off.
Yeah.
Go on, have one, Phil.
Real Cockney dish. Come on,
they
Phil.
look absolutely disgusting.
Oh, they're beautiful.
Take a bite.
You were down on the river yesterday, weren't you?
Yeah, I was, yeah. That's what I was afraid
one of our
of.
Lambeth Hills. Especially prepared for you and Tony.
Do you know how they catch them, Phil?
I'm about to be told.
Yeah, you put a horse's head in the river, and the eels love the old meat of the horse's head, and they pull up the horse about 5 days later, and it's covered in these little wriggling eels.
I'm sure.
Hence the flavour. You'll enjoy the flavour. Finish your eel off, Phil.
But they would have been pulling eels out of the Thames since Roman times, wouldn't they? This isn't some new delicacy.
Oh no, forever.
Yeah.
Smoke them as well.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I haven't got any
Anyway,
flag papers.
Tony, I'll keep those here for later. Let you and Phil get on with your
Well,
work.
thanks for breakfast.
All right.
That's great. But our search for the road's gone cold. Then Mick and Carenza have the brilliant idea of looking for it on water. They commandeer a London Fire Brigade boat and cruise down river towards the Palace of Westminster. They're going to drop a tape measure tied to a brick over the side to see how deep the water is opposite what was once Thorney Island. With the Houses of Parliament on one side and St Thomas's Hospital on the other, the boat drifts along midstream.
Let it down steady, I think. We don't want it to come off the end, do we? In the days of sonar, this is really quite low tech. Where's it going, Mick? Where's it going? It's going off.
I
think I've got one.
Down, probably.
You're about 8.5 feet.
About 8.5 feet.
Yeah.
Can we drift across and see?
We are very low spring.
Yeah.
We will, actually physically.
Can you actually feel it rubbing on the?
Yeah. The boat lifts out of the water.
So the local boatman knows about a sandbar that stretches across this area of the Thames. How shallow is it, and where is it exactly? In the incident room, the Geophys team were collating all their results. Everything in the palace turns out to be garden features, while Green Park turns up nothing at all. The ground has been too disturbed.
Yeah, that's banging up and down on the bottom.
That's about 2 metres 60 there.
2 metres 60. What's that in? What's
That's
that in
about
old money?
7'6".
About 7 foot there.
Yeah.
Where does that put us with the Roman river level then, Gus? Because it was lower, wasn't it?
Yes, you have to knock off a couple of metres, perhaps.
Yeah.
For the.
So we might almost be looking at a ridge across here if it existed in Roman time.
It could be fordable, yeah.
Almost walk across sort of thing.
How does this relate to the roads on the bank? Are we anywhere near Stangate that Robin's been talking
I think
about?
we've got to check that out later because it's somewhere in the area
Because we're
behind us.
downriver of Lambeth,
Yeah.
aren't we?
Story goes that you can physically walk across a causeway or something that runs across the lower side of Westminster Bridge. I mean, I've got nothing to bear that out.
Yeah.
It's just hearsay.
Well, you know, we heard a story that one of the peers from the upper house, sort of very tall chap,
Tallest member of the House.
the tallest
wasn't
member of
it?
the House, a part of the House of Lords, wasn't it? I think
House
that
of
one.
Lords, yeah, the
Had
tallest
actually
peer in the
walked
land.
across sometime in the 1950s.
This is very useful. This gives us exactly what we need.
Yeah.
If there is a bar here leading to that island, then instead of looking for the road on land, we look for the road from the river outwards.
At last, a decent break. We've found the likely crossing point, if not the road to it. From here, we went down river to try and answer that other question. Why didn't London grow up around Lambeth? The answer could be seen from the top of Southwark Cathedral near London Bridge. This is where the Roman city of Londinium actually started, isn't it? So how come they decided to build it here rather than a couple of miles down the road at Lambeth?
Well, the obvious reason looking from here is that it's higher ground. It would have been drier, a better place to build. This is actually a good commercial site. You know, it's a good place to bring your ships up with trading activities, stone, imports and all the rest of it. You know, you're not just supplying the Roman army then.
That's absolutely right.
Developing it as a civil settlement.
That's right, and the water here is deeper than at Westminster, or so our records seem to show. So while Westminster is a good crossing place, if you just want to get from A to B, if you actually want a good berthing place, where you want to bring deep water vessels as far into the country as you can, then London is a better place. You can put a crossing there, but you can also have a port.
So we're seeing two different criteria here, aren't we? Down at Lambeth, we're looking at a shallow river, which is ideal for taking the army and its supplies across. It's shallow water, there are probably ferries you might even be able to walk across, and that's ideal at that stage.
Whereas up here, we've got the deep water berth. The water here seems to be much deeper than it is at Westminster.
And you'd require that when your imperial power had really pegged down the local people and you weren't so worried about military tactics, you actually wanted a trade.
That's
so
right,
you wanted deep water and building ports and all that. Back at the incident room, our 3D topographical picture's finally taking shape. Now all we have to do is calibrate the possible tidal range and add that to where the river would be. Work in the trench was drawing to an end, and we began analysing all the finds. These heavy roof tiles suggest a large administrative building, possibly associated with the crossing point. There's definitely an early Roman settlement here, quite possibly the first Roman buildings beside the Thames, the beginnings of London. At last, all our data from trenches, boreholes and depth soundings in the Thames have been turned into a 3D picture. The grey areas are gravel levels, the dry land in Roman times. The green is marsh or bog. Let's see what it looks like with the river added. This bit is Thorney Island, where the Houses of Parliament now stand. Our work over the weekends proved that there was, in fact, a high ridge of dry land on the Lambeth bank, and that's where the road would have been, north of the Palace Gardens. We also located a sandbar opposite, which during Roman times would have been shallow enough to ford at low tide. At high tide, it's even more clear there was only one possible place along the river you could have got across. Last but not least, we think we know where Staingate used to be. What has Florence Nightingale got to do with the first Roman road?
I was afraid you might ask me that. Well, back at the incident room, Bernard and Stewart have replotted John Roke's 18th century map of London onto the Ordnance Survey digital map. And that shows that Stangate Stairs, as near as Damit, lay right under Florence Nightingale here in the grounds of St Thomas's Hospital.
And that's about, what, 20 yards away from where the Thames is now?
Yes, it's a very good indication as to how much of the river has been reclaimed in that intervening, 250 years. Yes. And so this is where I believe the Roman road approached the river and where the ancient crossing point was. And I find it inescapable that this is the route that Claudius took. And then this morning we got the marvellous news from Mick and Carenza on their boat trip, where they'd found a fireman who had intimate knowledge of the configuration of the bed of the River Thames at this point, which showed that here there was a massive, wide bank underneath the Thames at this point, the perfect footing for an ancient crossing over to what was Thorney Island and became the home of the Palace of Westminster.
So this must be our first crossing?
Well, I mean, this is the question the Time team came here this weekend to answer.
So maybe the story looks like this. The first Roman legions, having scouted the area, could have crossed the Thames here under what is now St Thomas's Hospital. They built their road along a high gravel ridge, forded the river at low tide to Thorney Island, then continued to dry land. At the crossing, they'd eventually have built way stations, the roof tiles of which we may have found in the trench. But when it came to setting up a permanent settlement, they moved downriver, built the dogleg up to the Thames, then a bridge, and Londinium followed. And that's how we think London began.